To Patience, my daughter-in-law said, raising her glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The only thing Margaret has left. The room filled with polite laughter, the kind people offer when they're not entirely sure if something is a joke or a quiet cruelty dressed as one. And I sat there at the head of my own dining table, fingers lightly wrapped around the stem of my untouched wine glass, feeling every pair of eyes flicker toward me for just a second too long before looking away again. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I simply smiled, the same gentle, measured smile I had perfected over decades of marriage, motherhood, and learning that silence often reveals more than words ever could. It was my 70th birthday, though you wouldn't have known it from the way the evening unfolded. I had spent the morning arranging fresh lilies in the center of the table, the scent soft and clean, something my late husband, Richard, used to love. I had chosen my navy dress carefully, pressed it myself, even set out the good china, the one we only used for holidays and special occasions. I suppose I still believed this would be one of those occasions. Daniel sat 2 seats down from me, his shoulders slightly hunched as he scrolled through his phone between bites, only occasionally glancing up when Sophie nudged him or added something to the conversation. My son used to look at me differently. There was a time when he would have noticed the way my hands trembled just slightly when I reached for my fork, or the way I paused half a second too long after Sophie's toast. Now, he just smiled when she did, nodded when she spoke, as if her words had quietly replaced his own. "You've always been so calm, Margaret," Sophie continued, tilting her head just enough to make the compliment sound like something else entirely. "It must be nice, having that much time to just wait things out." Another ripple of laughter moved through the table, softer this time, more controlled, like people were beginning to sense the edge beneath her words but weren't quite willing to step away from it. I lowered my gaze to my plate, noticing how neatly everything had been arranged, the roasted chicken, the green beans, the small baked potatoes, all prepared exactly the way Daniel used to ask for when he was a boy. It struck me then, not with pain exactly, but with a kind of quiet clarity, that I was no longer cooking for him. I was maintaining a memory. "Mom, you okay?" Daniel asked, though his eyes didn't quite meet mine when he said it. I nodded once, a small, controlled movement. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice steady, almost too steady. And I was. That was the surprising part. Because as I sat there, listening to the soft clinking of silverware and the carefully measured laughter, I began to understand something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. This wasn't new. It hadn't started tonight. The jokes, the little comments, the way decisions were made without me, around me, as if I were already halfway out of the room. This had been building for months, maybe longer. I had just been patient enough not to interrupt it. Sophie leaned back in her chair, satisfied, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm like a quiet claim. "Patience is a virtue," she added, almost as an afterthought. I met her gaze then, just for a moment, long enough to see the certainty there, the confidence of someone who believed they understood exactly who they were dealing with. I smiled again, just as gently as before, and took a slow sip of my wine. They thought my silence meant I didn't see what was happening. They thought patience meant I would simply wait and accept whatever came next. They were wrong. I did not sleep much that night, not because of what was said, but because of how easily it had been said, as if my presence at that table had already been reduced to something optional, something decorative, like the lilies in the center that would wilt quietly in a few days without anyone really noticing. And I sat at my kitchen table early the next morning with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the sunlight stretch slowly across the hardwood floor, thinking about how many mornings I had spent in this same chair over the past 40 years, first as a young wife, then as a mother, and eventually as a widow learning how to fill silence that used to belong to someone else. The house still held traces of Richard in small, stubborn ways, the way his old coat remained in the hallway closet, the way the garage light flickered twice before staying on, the way the backyard gate never quite closed unless you pushed it just a little harder. Details I had memorized not because I needed to, but because they reminded me that this place had once been built on something solid, something shared. After he passed, I told myself that Daniel would still be that connection, that bridge between what had been and what remained, and for a while, I believed it. Even when the phone calls became shorter, even when holidays started to feel more like obligations than gatherings, even when Sophie's presence began to reshape the rhythm of everything in ways I could not quite name at first. It had not been sudden. That was the part that unsettled me the most. It was gradual, almost careful, like a series of small adjustments no one thought to question. A dinner moved to their house instead of mine. A holiday scheduled earlier without asking if I could make it. Conversations that paused just a second too long when I entered the room. I had noticed, of course. I had always noticed. I simply chose not to interrupt it. Patience, I had learned, often gives people the space to reveal who they are when they believe no one is watching. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, my steps measured, my mind quieter than it had been in months. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that what I had been calling distance was something far more deliberate. When I passed the small desk near the living room, I stopped, my eyes settling on a stack of mail Daniel had left behind the previous evening. Envelopes neatly placed but not addressed to me, which in itself was not unusual, except for the way one of them had been partially opened and then tucked back as if someone had changed their mind halfway through. I should have walked past it. I knew that. But something about the weight of the silence from the night before lingered in my chest, and I reached for the envelope with a steady hand, turning it over just enough to see the return address. It was from a financial office I recognized, one Richard and I had worked with years ago when we first organized our estate, and I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside me. Not panic, not even fear, just a quiet awareness that something had moved without me being told. I placed the envelope back exactly where it had been, aligning it with the others as if nothing had changed, because in that moment, I understood something clearly and completely. Whatever was happening, it had already begun long before last night. And if they believed I would continue to sit quietly at the table, smiling, waiting, then perhaps that was exactly what I should let them believe, at least for now. I left the house later than usual that morning, not because I had anywhere urgent to be, but because I wanted to see if anything would change in my absence. And sometimes the simplest way to understand a situation is to remove yourself from it and observe what shifts when you are no longer in the room. So I drove to the small grocery store just under 3 miles away, the same one I had been going to for years, where the cashier still recognized me and asked about my garden in the spring, and I moved slowly through the aisles, picking up items I did not really need, giving myself time to think without appearing as though I was thinking at all. When I returned home, the house was quiet, but not in the familiar way I had grown used to, not the soft quiet of a lived-in space, but something more deliberate, more arranged. And as I stepped inside, I noticed immediately that the stack of mail on the desk had been disturbed, not dramatically, not carelessly, but just enough that the envelope I had seen earlier was now missing. I set my keys down without making a sound and walked further into the house, listening, not for noise, but for absence. And after a moment, I heard the faint murmur of voices coming from the living room, low, controlled, as if whoever was speaking did not want to be overheard, but had grown comfortable enough to believe they would not be. I paused just out of sight, not hiding exactly, but not announcing myself either, and I recognized Daniel's voice first, quieter than usual, edged with something that sounded like hesitation. "Are you sure we should not just tell her?" he said, the words barely above a whisper. There was a short pause, followed by the soft, confident tone I had come to associate with Sophie, smooth and certain in a way that left little room for doubt. "And risk her slowing everything down?" she replied, almost lightly. "Daniel, she has had her time. We are just making things more efficient." Efficient. The words settled in the air with a weight that surprised me, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the strap of my purse, not from anger, but from recognition. "It is still her house," Daniel said after a moment, though there was no real conviction behind it, only the faint echo of something he used to believe. Sophie let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. "Technically, yes, but not for long if we do this right. The paperwork is already moving. Your name is going to be on everything soon enough." There was a rustle of paper, and I did not need to see it to know what she was referring to. I had spent too many years sitting beside Richard at tables like this, signing documents, reviewing details, understanding what each line meant and what each signature allowed. "She will not fight it," Sophie continued, her voice softer now, almost reassuring. "She is patient, remember? That is her whole thing." Another pause. I imagined Daniel nodding, the way he always did when he wanted to avoid conflict. when agreement felt easier than resistance. "I just do not want this to get messy," he said. "It will not," Sophie replied. "Not if we handle it the right way." I stepped back then, moving quietly toward the front door, my expression unchanged, my breathing even, as if I had not heard a single word, because in that moment, I understood that whatever questions I had been holding on to were no longer necessary. The answers had been there all along, hidden not in secrecy, but in assumption. They believed I would not look closely. They believed I would not understand. And most of all, they believed I would not act. I opened the door gently, stepped outside, and closed it behind me with the same care, already knowing exactly what I needed to do next. I did not rush, not because there was nothing to be done, but because rushing would have meant reacting, and reacting was exactly what they expected from someone in my position, someone they believed was already a step behind. So instead I drove across town at a steady pace, passing the same intersections I had driven through for decades, each one carrying memories that felt distant now, as if they belonged to a different version of my life. And when I pulled into the small parking lot of the financial office, I sat for a moment with my hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, letting the engine idle just long enough for my thoughts to settle into something clear and deliberate. The building had not changed much over the years. The same brick exterior, the same narrow glass doors, the same quiet sense of order that had once reassured me when Richard and I first walked in together, younger and full of plans we thought would carry us through everything. And as I stepped inside, I noticed how familiar the air felt, not comforting exactly, but steady, like a place where things were written down, documented, made official in ways that could not easily be undone. A receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, and I returned it with the same calm expression I had worn the night before, giving my name without hesitation, watching the brief flicker of recognition cross her face before she nodded and asked me to wait. I did not have to wait long. "Margaret?" A voice called gently from down the hallway, and when I turned, I saw a man I had not expected to feel relief upon seeing, but did, nonetheless. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice steady as I walked toward him, noticing how time had softened his features, but not his posture, still upright, still precise. "It has been a long time," he replied, offering a small, respectful smile as he gestured for me to follow him into his office. I sat across from him, folding my hands neatly in my lap, taking in the familiar surroundings, the organized stacks of folders, the framed certifications on the wall, the quiet hum of a place where decisions carried weight. "What can I help you with today?" he asked, and for a moment, I considered how much to say, how directly to speak, but I had already spent enough time being careful with my words in the wrong rooms. "I believe documents have been filed or are being prepared that involve my property and my name," I said evenly, and I was not informed. There was a brief pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, and Mr. Harrison leaned back slightly, his expression shifting in a way that told me he understood more than I had explicitly stated. "Do you have reason to believe something has been altered without your consent?" he asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I have reason to believe that assumptions are being made about what I will allow," I replied. He nodded once, slowly, then reached for a file cabinet behind him, pulling open a drawer with practiced ease and scanning through a series of folders before selecting one and placing it carefully on the desk between us. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked at me again, measuring, as if confirming something. "Margaret," he said quietly, "nothing regarding your assets can be legally transferred without your authorization, not if everything is structured the way your husband intended." The mention of Richard's intentions settled something deep inside me, not as comfort, but as clarity. "Then I would like to review everything," I said. "All current filings, all pending requests, and any documents that have been initiated in my name." He inclined his head, opening the folder at last, revealing a set of papers that, even from a distance, I could recognize by their format and structure, and as he began to explain what had been submitted, what had been requested, and more importantly, what had not yet been completed, I listened without interruption, my expression unchanged, my mind moving carefully through each detail, each timeline, each signature line that had not yet been signed. They believed things were already in motion. They believed outcomes were inevitable. They were wrong about that as well. When Mr. Harrison finished, he closed the folder gently, and looked at me with a question he did not need to ask out loud, and I gave a small, composed nod. "I will need your assistance," I said, "but not to stop them." I paused briefly, just enough to let the weight of my next words settle into place. "I would like to let them continue." Mr. Harrison did not respond immediately, which I appreciated, because silence, when handled properly, allows truth to settle without being forced, and I could see in the way he leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the edge of the folder, that he was considering not just what I had said, but what it implied, the difference between stopping something and allowing it to unfold under controlled circumstances. "You understand the risk," he said finally, his tone measured, not warning, but clarifying. I nodded once. "I understand the timing," I replied, and that seemed to be enough. He exhaled quietly, then reached for a notepad, writing a few lines in precise, deliberate strokes before turning it slightly toward me. "If they are initiating transfers or preparing documents, they will need your signature at some point," he said. "Without it, nothing becomes final." I looked at the page, then back at him. "And if they believe they already have it?" I asked. His expression sharpened just enough to confirm that he understood the direction of my thinking. "Then we document everything," he said. "Every request, every draft, every communication. We let the process continue, but under observation." Observation. The word felt appropriate. I had spent years observing small shifts in tone, in behavior, in intention, and now I would simply extend that patience into something more structured, more precise. "I will also need copies of any documents that require my authorization," I added, "before anything is presented to me at home." He nodded again, making another note. "That can be arranged." There was no urgency in his movements, no unnecessary emphasis, just a quiet alignment of steps that would allow things to proceed exactly as they needed to. When I left his office, the afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and I paused beside my car for a moment, not to gather myself, but to acknowledge the shift that had already taken place. Nothing had been stopped. Nothing had been confronted. And yet everything had changed. The drive home felt shorter than before, not because the distance had changed, but because my attention had narrowed, focusing not on what had been done, but on what would be done next. When I walked through the front door, the house was once again quiet, the same arranged stillness I had noticed earlier, and for a moment, it almost felt staged, as if the absence of sound itself had become part of the plan. I set my purse down in the same place as always, moved through the kitchen, and began preparing dinner with the same care I always had, measuring ingredients, setting the table, maintaining the rhythm they expected to see. When Daniel and Sophie arrived later that evening, nothing in my demeanor had changed. I greeted them with a soft smile, asked about their day, listened as Sophie spoke about a meeting that had gone well, the details vague but delivered with confidence, and Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding something that did not quite connect to the story, but filled the space nonetheless. At one point, Sophie glanced at me, her eyes searching, as if testing whether anything had shifted beneath the surface. I met her gaze briefly, then returned my attention to my plate, giving her nothing to confirm, nothing to challenge. "We might need to go over some paperwork with you soon," she said casually, as if mentioning a minor household task. "Just some updates. Nothing complicated." I took a small sip of water before responding, my voice as even as ever. "Of course," I said. "Whenever you are ready." She smiled then, satisfied, her posture relaxing just slightly, and Daniel looked relieved in a way that might have gone unnoticed by someone who was not paying attention. But I was paying attention, to every word, every glance, every assumption they made about what I would or would not do. They believed the next step belonged to them. They believed I would follow where they led. And so I would, just not in the way they expected. The next morning arrived without urgency, which was exactly how I needed it, because urgency creates mistakes, and mistakes were not something I could afford anymore. So I moved through my routine with the same quiet precision, making breakfast, opening the curtains just enough to let in the light without drawing attention to anything different. And when I heard the soft chime of my phone on the kitchen counter, I did not reach for it immediately. I let it sit there for a few seconds, allowing the moment to remain ordinary before I picked it up and saw Daniel's name on the screen. "Hey Mom," his message read, casual, almost rehearsed. "Sophie and I are stopping by later. Just need to go over a few documents with you. Should not take long." I stared at the words for a moment, not because they surprised me, but because of how carefully they were framed, the reassurance, the simplicity, the quiet assumption that I would agree without question, and I typed back a single sentence. That is fine. I will be here. There was no need for more. The rest of the day unfolded slowly, intentionally, each hour passing with a kind of steady calm that might have looked like routine from the outside, but underneath it, everything was being measured, every detail aligned with what I now understood was coming. I took out the same set of dishes I had used before, arranged them neatly, not out of habit this time, but out of choice, because familiarity would keep them comfortable and comfort would keep them careless. When they arrived in the late afternoon, Sophie entered first, her energy composed, her smile practiced, carrying a slim folder tucked under her arm as if it were just another item on a list of errands. Daniel followed behind her, quieter, his expression harder to read, but his eyes moved quickly around the room, not quite settling anywhere for long. "Hi, Mom," he said, stepping forward to give me a brief hug, one that felt more like an obligation than a connection. I returned it gently, just as I always had. "Come in," I said, stepping aside, my voice warm, steady, unchanged. We sat at the dining table, the same one where everything had begun to shift just days before, and Sophie placed the folder in front of her, opening it with careful ease, her movements controlled, confident. "We just need to update a few things," she said, sliding the first page toward me. "Nothing major. Just making sure everything is organized for the future." I looked down at the document, my eyes moving slowly across the lines, not because I needed time to understand, but because I needed them to believe I did, and the language was familiar, structured in a way that suggested routine adjustments, small changes, but beneath it, I could see exactly what Mr. Harrison had described, the positioning, the gradual shift of control, the preparation for something more permanent. "Take your time," Sophie added, her tone light, almost generous. I nodded once, tracing the edge of the paper with my finger before lifting my gaze briefly to meet hers. "It seems straightforward," I said, my voice even. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, his hands clasped together, watching me more closely now, as if searching for something he could not quite define. "We just want to make things easier for you," he said, the words sounding practiced, but not entirely comfortable. "Easier." I let the words settle between us, just as I had done before, then reached for the pen they had placed beside the document. My hand did not tremble. My expression did not change. I signed my name slowly, carefully, exactly where they had indicated, then set the pen down with the same quiet control. Sophie's shoulders relaxed almost immediately, her smile widening just enough to reveal her satisfaction, and Daniel exhaled softly, as if a tension he had been holding onto had finally released. "That is all we needed for today," Sophie said, gathering the papers with a smooth, efficient motion, tapping them lightly into place. I nodded, folding my hands together on the table. "Of course," I replied. They stayed only a few minutes longer, exchanging small talk that felt thinner now, more distant, before standing to leave, and as I walked them to the door, Sophie paused just long enough to glance back at me, her expression calm, assured, certain that everything was moving exactly as she had planned. I returned her look with the same gentle smile I had given her before, offering nothing to disrupt that belief. When the door closed behind them, the house fell quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but complete. I walked back to the table, looked at the space where the documents had been, and allowed myself a single, quiet breath. They thought they had taken the first step. They thought I had followed. But the moment my name touched that page, the outcome they were expecting had already begun to change. The following days unfolded exactly as I expected, which was to say they unfolded quietly, with no sudden changes, no dramatic shifts, only small confirmations that everything was moving forward according to a plan that they believed they controlled, and I allowed myself to settle into that rhythm, responding when spoken to, agreeing when asked, maintaining the same steady presence they had already begun to underestimate. Sophie called twice, both times with the same light tone, asking if I had received copies of the documents, if everything looked good. And each time I answered simply, "Yes, everything looks fine," because from their perspective, it did, and it was important that it continued to appear that way. Daniel did not call. That, more than anything, told me where he stood, not fully leading, not fully resisting, just moving along the path that had been laid out in front of him, hoping perhaps that things would resolve themselves without requiring him to take a position. I had seen that before, in smaller ways, over the years, but now it carried more weight, more consequence. 3 days later, I received a message from Mr. Harrison asking if I was available to come in, and I arranged my morning accordingly, leaving the house just after 9, the air still cool, the streets quiet in that way they often are before the day fully begins. When I arrived, he was already waiting, a file placed neatly on his desk, thicker than before, its contents expanded by everything that had been set in motion since my last visit. "They have proceeded quickly," he said as I sat down, his tone neutral, factual. I nodded once. "They believe there is no reason to hesitate," I replied. He opened the file, turning it toward me, and as I reviewed the documents, I saw the progression clearly, the initial requests, the sign pages, my signature included exactly where they needed it to be, and beneath that, the next steps they had already prepared, transfers that would only become valid under specific conditions, conditions that had not yet been met, conditions that, without their knowledge, had already been altered. "Everything is documented," Mr. Harrison continued. "Every submission, every timestamp, every version of the paperwork. There will be no ambiguity about what was presented to you and what was authorized." I traced the edge of one page with my finger, noting the details not just for what they said, but for what they implied, the confidence behind them, the assumption that the path ahead was clear. "And the revisions?" I asked. He slid another set of documents toward me, separate, carefully prepared. "Filed this morning," he said. "Your assets are now structured in a way that prevents any transfer without your direct, verified approval under conditions they do not meet. Additionally, secondary protections have been placed on the property." I looked at the papers, then back at him. "So when they proceed," I said slowly, "what they expect to happen will not occur." He gave a small, confirming nod. "Correct. The process will appear to move forward until the moment it cannot." I allowed that to settle, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was never about stopping them abruptly, never about confrontation or accusation. It was about timing, about allowing them to step fully into a position they believed was secure before revealing that it was not. When I left the office, the sun had risen higher, the streets busier now, but my focus remained steady, unchanged, and as I drove home, I thought about the way Sophie had smiled when I signed those papers, the way Daniel had relaxed, the quiet relief that had passed between them, and I realized that what they were feeling now was not just confidence, it was certainty. And certainty, when misplaced, has a way of revealing itself at exactly the right moment. When I walked back into the house, everything was as I had left it, the same arrangement, the same stillness, and I moved through it without pause, already knowing that the next time we sat at that table, nothing would need to be said for everything to be understood. They chose the timing themselves, which made everything easier, because when people believe they are in control of when something happens, they rarely question what happens within it. And Sophie called that afternoon with the same calm tone she always used when she was certain of the outcome, suggesting we all sit down together the following evening to finalize a few remaining details. Her words light, almost casual, as if the decision had already been made, and this was simply the last step in a process that required my presence, but not my influence. I agreed without hesitation, my voice steady, my response simple, because agreement, at this stage, was not submission, it was positioning. The next day passed with a kind of quiet clarity, each moment settling into place exactly where it needed to, and by the time evening arrived, I had already prepared the table once again, the same arrangement, the same dishes, the same careful attention to detail that had become almost invisible to them over time, and when Daniel and Sophie walked in, there was a subtle shift in their energy, not visible in anything obvious, but present in the way they moved, the way Sophie carried her folder with just a little more confidence, the way Daniel did not hesitate as much when he stepped inside. We sat down, the three of us, and for a moment, there was only the soft sound of chairs adjusting, plates being moved, the quiet rituals of a meal beginning, and then Sophie opened the folder, placing a new set of documents on the table between us. "This is just the final step," she said. her tone composed, almost reassuring. Once this is signed, everything will be streamlined, and you will not have to worry about any of it anymore. I looked down at the papers, recognizing the structure immediately, the progression from what had been signed before to what they now expected to complete, and I let my eyes move slowly across the lines, not because I needed to understand them, but because they expected me to take my time, to appear careful, even hesitant. It seems like a lot, I said softly, allowing just a trace of uncertainty into my voice, something small, something believable. Sophie leaned forward slightly, her expression warm, patient in a way that felt practiced. It only looks complicated, she said. It is really just making things easier for you in the long run. Daniel nodded beside her, his hands resting on the table, his fingers loosely intertwined, and he added quietly, "We just want to make sure everything is taken care of." I let a small silence settle between us, just long enough to reinforce the impression they had already formed, then reached for the pen again, my movements unhurried, deliberate, and signed where they indicated, one page after another. Each signature placed exactly where they needed it to be, each motion reinforcing their belief that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Sophie gathered the papers carefully, aligning them with a small, satisfied motion, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax completely, the tension leaving her shoulders, her posture settling into something that looked almost like relief. "That is it," she said, closing the folder. "Everything is in place now." I looked at her, then at Daniel, who seemed lighter somehow, as if a quiet burden had been lifted without him having to fully acknowledge it, and I gave them the same gentle smile I had given them before, the same calm expression that had allowed them to move forward without question. "I am glad," I said simply. We finished dinner without much conversation after that, the air between us filled with a kind of quiet finality they seemed to interpret as closure, and when they stood to leave, Sophie paused at the door, turning back just slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a confidence that had grown stronger with each step they believed they had secured. "Everything is going to be better now," she said. I held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, my expression unchanged. "Yes," I replied softly. "It will be." And as the door closed behind them, the silence that followed did not feel uncertain or heavy, but precise, as if every piece had been placed exactly where it needed to be, waiting only for the moment when what they believed to be finished would reveal itself as something entirely different. The call came 2 days later, just after 10 in the morning, at a time when people expect ordinary things to happen, not moments that quietly reshape everything they thought was already settled, and I was standing by the kitchen window, watering the small plants I had kept alive for years, when my phone rang and Sophie's name appeared on the screen, her confidence arriving even before her voice did. "Margaret," she said, her tone controlled but carrying a thin edge beneath it, something unfamiliar, something that had not been there before. "There seems to be a small issue with the paperwork." I set the watering can down carefully, drying my hands on a towel before bringing the phone closer. "An issue?" I repeated, my voice calm, almost curious. There was a brief pause on the other end, not long, but long enough to suggest that whatever she had expected, it was not this. "Yes," she said, more firmly now. "The transfer did not go through the way it was supposed to. We are at the office now, and they are saying additional verification is required." I walked slowly to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down, allowing the moment to stretch just slightly. "That sounds important," I said evenly. "Do you need me to come in?" Another pause, this one tighter, more controlled. "Yes," she replied. "That would be best." When I arrived at the office, Daniel and Sophie were already there, seated across from Mr. Harrison, who looked exactly as he had the last time I saw him, composed, precise, his hands resting lightly on the table as if nothing about this meeting was unexpected. Sophie turned as I entered, her expression composed but strained at the edges, her usual confidence no longer quite as effortless. "There you are," she said, standing quickly. Daniel remained seated, his posture rigid, his eyes moving between us, uncertain. I took my seat across from them, placing my purse neatly beside me, and looked at Mr. Harrison. "I understand there is a problem," I said. He inclined his head slightly, opening the file in front of him with the same deliberate care. "There is no problem," he replied calmly. "There is simply a clarification." Sophie's expression tightened. The documents were signed, she said, her voice sharper now. Everything was completed. Mr. Harrison nodded once. The documents were signed, he agreed. However, the structure of the assets, as revised under Mrs. Collins' direction, requires direct, verified authorization under conditions that were not met. The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled because it is already saying everything. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice low. Mr. Harrison turned a page, sliding it gently toward them. "It means that no transfer of ownership can occur without Mrs. Collins' explicit approval under the updated terms," he said. "Terms that were filed and legally recognized prior to the submission of these documents." Sophie's hand tightened around the edge of the table. "That is not what we agreed to," she said, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the frustration beneath it. I looked at her then, really looked at her, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with the same quiet clarity that had carried me through every step of this process. "No," I said softly. "It is exactly what I agreed to." Daniel's eyes shifted toward me, searching, as if trying to understand when the ground beneath him had changed. "Mom," he began, but the word faded before it could become anything more. I folded my hands together on the table, my posture steady, my voice calm. "You believed my patience meant I was not paying attention," I continued, not raising my voice, not needing to. "But patience is not about waiting without understanding. It is about knowing when to act." Sophie did not speak. She did not need to. The certainty she had carried so easily before had been replaced by something else now, something quieter, less certain, and for the first time, she did not look at me as if she already knew the outcome. I stood then, smoothing the front of my dress with a simple, practiced motion. "Everything is exactly as it should be," I said, my tone even, final. "Nothing has been taken from me, and nothing will be." I turned toward the door without waiting for a response, without needing one, and as I stepped out into the hallway, the quiet that followed felt different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but complete, as if the last piece had finally settled into place, exactly where it had always been meant to be.